Hello, everyone. Today we will be continuing our APUSH series with the Period 6 review. We're going to talk about big business. We're going to talk about corruption. We're going to get into all that. So let's hop straight into it. Okay, so I guess we should first start with the different kinds of industries that we saw during this era. So one of the big things was the rising railroad industry. So if you want an example of of someone who ran this, you can say Vanderbilt. That's a great idea, right? But particularly railroads can be also used as an example of the national Grange movement. And essentially, what this is farmers during this era would transport their crops and their goods through railroads, but railroad companies would gouge their prices. They would raise their prices way up. They'd make it unaffordable for farmers to use their services. So farmers formed the National Grange Movement, which this is kind of a movement together of a bunch of farmers to fight against all all these things that was going on against them, because also at this time farmers were going through a lot of economic trouble. So this is kind of the movement that arose from that. And if you want something again to show the regulation of railroads or a policy that the National Grange Movement ended up passing, you can talk about the Interstate Commerce Act. Interstate Commerce Act. And what this did is that this created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which basically said that over state lines, the federal government could regulate and put a cap on how expensive railroads can make their services. So that way, farmers can afford their services, sell their crops, whatever. So that's the railroad industry. Now let's get into steel industry. So the name that you want to know for the steel industry is Andrew Carnegie, right? So Andrew Carnegie is known for his vertical integration. So if you need an example of vertical integration, you can mention Andrew Carnegie and his steel, American steel, right? Also, something else with the steel industry is that it became a big thing because of the Bessemer steel process. So this is a great example of technological development that led to a boom in this industry. So this is a great example of that Bessemer steel process, right? So this ties to steel once again, and of course Andrew Carnegie, the man who made American steel, right? He was the big name behind the steel industry, and he used vertical integration, as I mentioned before. And if you don't know what that is, vertical integration is essentially owning all the steps in one business. So basically, um, manufacturing the steel, transporting the steel, selling the steel, all of that was owned by Andrew Carnegie. Okay, so that's the steel industry. So now we can move on to electricity. So electricity, there's a couple big names you can bring up with this. So electricity, we should think Thomas Edison. This is his era now. Thomas Edison. Obviously, we all know invented the light bulb, all that good stuff. We also have George Westinghouse, right? George Westinghouse. And if you need more stuff on these guys, you can mention how they created AC/DC current. Well, what I'm giving you guys right now is a bunch of examples that on an FRQ you can list. So you can just list all these examples about the different kinds of technological advancements that were created. So I'd say for electricity, the big thing is, of course, light bulbs, right? Light bulbs, AC/DC current. That's pretty important too. Okay, now last but not least, we have the oil industry. Now for this one, the big name you got to know is John D. Rockefeller. All right. So he used something called horizontal horizontal integration. And essentially what this is, horizontal integration, is the as I said before, vertical integration was owning all the steps, right? Horizontal integration is owning all companies on one step. So for example, maybe instead of owning, like in the case of Andrew Carnegie, instead of owning the manufacturing of steel, the transportation of steel, the selling of steel, whatever, horizontal integration would be owning every single company that makes oil, but the transportation and the selling, other people do that. So that's what horizontal integration is. And that'd be under John D. Rockefeller. Also, some other important names that I didn't mention before are Henry Ford, right? Invented the Model T, Ford Model T, first automobile, right? So this is another example, Model T, first car, right? And also another thing that Henry Ford did was the assembly line, and this is really important to the optimization and efficiency of factories at the time. And what this also shows, which is pretty important, is this, the assembly line, demonstrates a further change from skilled labor, skilled labor to unskilled labor. Because essentially what happened is it would be an assembly line. To build the cars, it'd be an employee who does one specific step. He puts one screw in. He knows just how to put that one screw in. And as the part would travel down the assembly line, each person would do their one task that they know how to do, and it would build the car once it got to the end of the assembly line. And this greatly optimized the workplace. Now, what this is based off of is Frederick Taylor, this guy right here, right? So what he came up with was something called scientific scientific management. All right. Now, what scientific management is exactly what the assembly line did. It means the optimization and the efficiency of the factory, and literally sitting there with like a stopwatch and shaving off as many seconds as you can off production time. So he came up with this idea of scientific management, which, as I said before, can be seen into the assembly line, and it creates this whole new idea in the American public of optimizing the workplace, shaving off seconds, and making things as efficient as possible. Okay, so let's get into the politics of the Gilded Age. So there, these are the two big ideologies during this era. So basically, laissez-faire meant that the government didn't intervene with business, and it didn't really intervene with much. Um, um the laissez-faire, that's exactly what it means. Just government doesn't touch business. And this is going to be the dominant political system, like political ideology of the time. Now, something that backed this up was social Darwinism. And now what that is, it plays off of the idea of evolution, of Darwin's theory of evolution, that is like, survival of the fittest. So basically, social Darwinism is the rich got rich because they're the fittest to be rich. And so survival of the fittest, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So this backs laissez-faire up because it says, oh, the rich deserve to be rich, the government should not intervene. So that's what social Darwinism is. During this time, the two main political parties was Republicans versus Democrats. However, I'm going to get into later how there was also some new political parties like the Populist Party, Socialist Party, but I'll get into that. So a new big thing here was also unions, because during this time, as I mentioned before, with the rise of industry, there was a lot of factories that changed to unskilled labor. But the thing is that these workers didn't have rights. They didn't have a lot of rights, so they would be treated very poorly. They'd have lots of working hours. There'd be things like child labor, and a lot of incidents would happen in these factories. So basically, unions fought for workers' rights, and some examples of this. I'll write them here. Some examples of this is the American Federation of Labor, Federation of Labor, and the Knights of Labor. And these two groups are going to be pretty important examples that you should definitely know. And these two are examples of unions that fought for workers' rights. Now, these two are kind of pretty closely grouped together, the Silver Movement and the Populist Party. So the Silver Movement, basically, they wanted to make silver a viable form of currency, and they wanted silver to be coined. It's called bimetallism is really the word for it. So I'll write that down for you. Bimetallism. So if you want a name that was kind of like a proponent of this, you can say William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Now, this more closely ties to the Populist Party. Now, this is pretty important. So basically what this is that this is kind of the party of the people, as it's called, the Populist Party. So this is the party of kind of the common man, everyone, the farmers. So this is really important actually, because this groups together a bunch of people. So you can think of it as, here, I'll write it over here so we can get the a list. Populist Party. Okay, so we can think of unions, right? Workers, farmers, as I was talking before about the national grange movement and all that. That's also a part of the Populist Party. So we have farmers, unions, right? And also, if we look at the Socialist Party, actually, before we get into that, let me finish with the Populist Party. So the Populist Party, it's unions, farmers, basically common people. That's what you can think of this as. Okay. So if you need things of what the Populist Party stood for, you can use bimetallism, as I mentioned before. Also, some other things that they stood for was direct election of senators. So this is pretty big because before, of course, nowadays, the people directly elect senators, but back in the day, it wasn't that way. So the Populist Party is responsible for this idea of direct election of senators, and also graduated income tax. That's also something else that they were for. Now, eventually, the Populist Party would get absorbed by the Democratic Party. So that's something important to know, that this kind of went away because it's everything that it stood for was absorbed into the Democratic Party. So therefore, most populists ended up voting Democrat. So the Populist Party kind of disappeared. Then there's also the Socialist Party, and the name behind this is Eugene V. Debs. So he's the guy that kind of founded this, and he's pretty important if you need it. Honestly, it's not, the Socialist Party isn't that important. I never saw it brought up anywhere at all, really. But if you need a name behind it, Eugene V. Debs, that's your guy. Okay, so something I forgot to bring up before was also the Gospel of Wealth, which is another ideology. And the Gospel of Wealth was Andrew Carnegie's idea. And it was basically saying, if you're rich, you should give back to the people. That's all you need to know about that. Okay, so now let's get into unions versus management. So what I'm going to be talking about is the strategies that they used against each other. So, because this is a very big idea throughout this period. So one way that unions fought against management was strikes. So if you need an example of that, you got Pullman strike, you got the Great Railroad strike. There's a couple of these, but these two should keep you covered on on strikes. And also, I guess you could technically say legislation, right? They tried getting legislation passed through political parties, right? And if you need an example, I guess you could use the Interstate Commerce Act or Interstate Commerce Commission. You know what I mean? With the National Grange Movement, the farmers. For management, you have scabs. So essentially, they would hire people who they knew wouldn't wouldn't back away during a strike, and they would continue to work through strikes, and that's what scabs were. So management would hire scabs. You also have yellow dog contracts. So essentially, what this was is it was a contract that said if you work for me, you can't join a union, thus you can't go on strike. That's essentially what that was. Also, they would also hire groups to go out and actually like fight the people on strike and beat them up and disperse them. If you need an example for that, you can use the Pinkertons. That's always a good group. So what I'm just giving you here are examples that highlight this dynamic that's very important throughout this unit. And these all just show the methods that they use to combat each other and specific examples for each one that, again, you could use on an LEQ, SAQ, or any kind of FRQ, really. All right, so now let's get into the closing of the frontier. So now basically everyone's moved as far out west as they can, and the entire frontier has been established. So this led to the creation of the cowboy, right? They were really known as vaqueros, right? And actually, something very interesting to know about cowboys is that a large majority of them were African American, and we're gonna get into this. We're gonna get into this later with the Exoduster movement. Actually, we can get into it now. So, as I said, a large majority of cowboys out west were African American, and that has to do with the Exoduster movement. So basically, from period 5, if you remember, we mentioned how the new system of labor in the South was the sharecropping system. And a lot of African Americans wanted to escape from it. So they migrated out west into Kansas, Great Plains area. So that's what we call the Exoduster movement. This migration of African Americans out west to find new jobs, new opportunities on the frontier, to become farmers, all that kind of thing, right? And a lot of them became cowboys, also known as vaqueros, right? Now, as soon as the frontier closed, we have the Turner thesis. So this is pretty important. This is something you should definitely know. So the Turner thesis basically was written by a guy, Turner, and he said, "Oh, well, the frontier has always been super important to American society because it was basically seen as a reset. If the people weren't happy, they could move out west, find a new home out west, and there was basically no one there, so they could start their own new life out west. But now that the frontier closed, the American people didn't have that. So his thesis would be, oh no, things are going to go badly in America now because we don't have a place to go. And this later during period 7 will lead. Well, this kind of thought will lead to the beginning of imperialism, along with a couple other reasons. But for this period, you don't really need to know that. This is just something that arose during this time. So, if you want some examples of new technology that was invented on the frontier, you got barbed wire. Because in the Great Plains, there wasn't a lot of trees and a lot of planks that they could make fences out of to hold their things in. So to hold their homes, all that kind of stuff. So they used barbed wire to enclose their farms and all that good stuff. So that's a pretty important invention from the frontier. Also, if you want to mention something, this is from period 5, but if you want to mention why all these people went out west, you can mention the Homestead Act. So if you're listing reasons for why people moved out west, you can use the Exoduster movement and the Homestead Act, which is basically just, and a lot of people free homesteads out west if they moved out west. So these two can be pretty important for explaining migration during period 5 and period 6. We have the cattle industry, which of course that has to do with cowboys, right? Now, before I get into Native Americans, because that's probably the most important part of the closed frontier, I'll get into mining. So obviously there was a lot of new resources being found, and this created something called boom towns. So essentially, resources would be found somewhere, and a bunch of people would move over there, move over there. They would create a town, which a boom town. So that's all you really got to know about that. There's not much else that's important. But now we're going to get into probably the most important part of the closed frontier: Native Americans, right? So before, the strategy was, oh, well, we're moving out west. Let's move the natives even further out west where we won't touch them anymore. But as you can see now, we went as far out west as we could go. So what are we going to do with the Native Americans? This is what that has to do with. So on this side, on this left side here, I have native resistance to Americans, and then on the right side I have the what the Americans wanted to do with natives. So essentially, native resistance includes the ghost dance, which this is very important for this. I'd remember this. The ghost dance, which is basically a form of retaliation, and it was kind of a spiritual thing to call on their ancestors to help save them from the oncoming Americans taking their land, all that, right? So this is more of a ritualistic type of resistance. Then you have the Sioux Wars, which is specifically a war where they physically retaliated against Americans and killed many Americans. So you have this as a physical kind of retaliation. So I'd say this is also pretty important. And then you have the Wounded Knee Massacre. Now this, I'd actually let me cut this off here because this isn't exactly a form of native retaliation. This is just I would use this as an example of Americans encroaching on Native Americans and their land. So the Wounded Knee Massacre, basically, some confusion happened while Americans and natives were interacting, and a bunch of natives got completely killed, massacred. Absolutely horrible. But this is a great example for this kind of thing. So this is a great example for this, for Americans killing natives, taking away their land, Wounded Knee Massacre, right? Then, on the American point of view, you have the Dawes Act. This is a very specific example of something they did. And basically, what this did is that it destroyed native reservations, right? Because there were reservations before, but now the Dawes Act completely got rid of them. And this was with the goal of assimilation. So basically, assimilation is this idea of getting Native Americans to become white men, whitewashing them, getting rid of all their culture, and implementing them into white society. So, getting them to get jobs, get farms, become Christian, all that. That's what the assimilation is. So the Dawes Act is a great example of Americans trying to assimilate Native Americans. And that is pretty much it for the closed frontier. There are a couple other details here and there, but they're not necessarily that important. If I had to say one thing that's the most definitely important thing that you need to know is the Turner thesis and Native Americans during the frontier. Okay, so we're going to finish our review on the Gilded Age with a quick talk about corruption during the Gilded Age. So, the big name you got to know for this, Boss Tweed. Really, honestly, that's all you got to know, and you don't even really need to know much. But if you need a name for corruption during the Gilded Age, Boss Tweed. And now, what he was a part of, which this is actually really important, urban political machines. So basically, what this was, it was kind of just taking advantage of the people to either get richer, and then two, get political votes for a certain party. So they, to give you an example, they do, let's say they do a favor for new immigrants coming in, whatever, and then they would take advantage of the fact that they did these favors and they'd force them to vote for a certain party. Also, if I haven't mentioned it already, it's pretty important to know that the main workforce during this era was immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. and they lived in pretty poor conditions. Which this is actually very important. You do have to know this. They lived in poor conditions, and during the next period 7, during the progressive movement, we're gonna see that come up. And with that, that is the end of our period 6 review. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in the rest of the reviews for APUSH 7, 8, and 9 coming out soon. So thank you very much. Please leave a like and subscribe. And I hoped this helped tremendously. Thank you very much for watching.